today's lesson, we are going to look at lesson 3 in chapter 7 of your textbook, and we're going to cover the first part of that, pages 262 through 265, and we are going to be looking at animal behavior, more specifically defining what behavior is, and then eventually looking to see the different types of animal behavior. So let's first of all just look on page 262 and identify that an animal's behavior consists of all the actions that it performs. So everything that it does, all of its actions, are its behavior. Those behaviors might include what it needs to do in order to obtain food, in order to avoid predators, or what it needs to do in order to find a mate. In previous lessons, we talked about how body structures for organisms have evolved over long periods of times and have adapted to surroundings. The same thing goes for behaviors. So just like body structures, the behaviors of animals are adaptations that evolved over a long period of time. So it's not just body structures of organisms that can adapt and evolve over time, but also behaviors can evolve and adapt over time as well. So here's sort of a combination of an adaptation or a feature, a characteristic of an animal that is also sort of used as a behavior as well. Notice that on this moth, the markings on this moth make it look like the eyes or the head of an owl. So obviously we can tell the difference, but if we were, some sort of animal that was coming up on this moth and we were going to eat it for our dinner, and then it opens its wings and we saw that very quickly, we might think that it was an owl instead. And if we are a small animal like a mouse or, a shrew or something like that, then we may be afraid that it's going to eat us instead and we may flee. So these moths have these markings on the underwings, and when the moth is frightened by a predator, it sort of raises its front wings, and that reveals those eyes and can cause the predator then to flee. So this is a combination of, the markings is an adaptation or characteristic, but over time the behavior has evolved where it will raise its wings when it is threatened in order to try to scare off whatever it is that is getting ready to eat it. So this next little section here talks about a hydra. And if you remember, you might have to go back and look in your book on page 245 when we talked about the hydra. So if you want to pause this and go take a quick look at the hydra to try and jog your memory on page 245. If you remember, the hydra was one of those little organisms that we said reproduced by budding. So where a new organism will sort of sprout off from the side, and then when it is large enough, it will then detach and go on its way. But it talks in this section here about how behaviors can be complex, and it uses the hydra as an example. And it says to consider what happens when water currents carries a small animal into the hydra's tentacles. The stinging cells on the tentacles catch the prey. The tentacles then bend toward the hydra's mouth, and at the same time, the hydra's mouth opens up to receive the food. So this is just sort of a behavior that happens when the prey gets close. Everything sort of goes into action. It touches the tentacles sting it, they pull it into the mouth, and it eats it. Let's look at that. I think it'll be a little bit better if we get a visual of what this looks like. So what you see here is the hydra. Coming in from the right is a mosquito larva. And when that larva gets close enough The tentacles will latch onto it, the little cells will sting it, and then as you will see here in a moment, those tentacles will start to bring the larva into the mouth of the hydra in order to consume it for food. So that was that hydra that we looked at several lessons ago on page 245 in your book, sort of coming to life so that you can see how it maneuvers and how it behaves, how it gets its food and eat. I thought that was kind of an interesting little video to tie into what we saw back on page 245. So behavior is a response. And if you remember, a few lessons ago, we talked about responses, and we said that there is a stimulus. And if you remember, what is a stimulus? It's the signal that causes an organism to react in some way. So it's what causes the organism to react. And then when the organism reacts or has a reaction, we call that the response. So the stimulus is what causes the reaction. The reaction is called the response. And it is important to know that all animals have behaviors that are responses to stimuli. Some of those stimuli are from outside the animal. So some stimuli are outside the animal. For example, the hydra that we just watched, that was an outside stimulus. The prey touched its tentacles and that caused the reaction. But still other stimuli, something like being hungry, comes from inside. So there are external and internal types of stimuli that can happen. Responses also can be external or internal. So faster heartbeat, for example, a reaction to move away from something. So what is the function of behavior then? Most behaviors are for the purpose of helping the animal survive or reproduce. So when an animal goes out and looks for food or hides to avoid a predator, it's doing something to help it stay alive. When it's searching for a mate or it's building a nest to take care of its young, it's behaving in a way that is going to help it reproduce. So we are going to look now at two categories of behavior. And the first is instinct. So a type of animal behavior, the two types of animal behaviors are instinct and learned. instinct, and I'm sure you've heard this term before, is a behavior that an animal performs without ever being taught how to do it. So an instinct is a response to a stimulus that is inborn. The animal is going to do it correctly the very first time. So spiders building a web is an example of instinct. They're not taught how to build a web, they just do it. The very first time that they try it, they're able to do it. Birds are able to build nests. They don't need to be taught by the mama and papa bird how to build a nest. They just instinctively know how to do it. These instincts are very important for the survival of the animal. Here is an example at the bottom that I find kind of interesting, is that hawks have very short necks, and they prey on these little gull chicks. So these chicks, when they're hatched on the ground, these hawks with the short necks will prey on them and eat them. Geese who have long necks don't prey on the chicks. These newly hatched chicks instinctively crouch down anytime that they see a shadow on the ground overhead that has a short neck. So if we observe these little chicks in the ground, if there's a shadow going over them and it has a short neck on the shadow, they will crouch down. If it has a longer neck on the shadow, then they don't crouch down. They don't sort of instinctively think of it as being a threat. So we would see that they would probably, it says to circle the bird shadows that will cause an older gull chick to crouch when it sees them. So those with a short neck that would cause the chick to crouch would probably be this one and this one. The one that is in the middle has a longer neck, would fly overhead, and the chicks would probably not have any sort of behavior or any sort of response to that stimulus because they don't see it as being a threat. The next type of behavior we're going to look at are learned behaviors. These are not instinct behaviors. So you probably did not just get on a bicycle and take off riding the very first time that you got on one. It probably took a few tries before you were able to do it very well. So that was learning. And learning is the process that leads to changes in behavior based on practice and experience. So in general, the larger that the brain is in an animal, the more that it is able to learn. And because those learned behaviors are a result from experiences, they're usually not done perfectly the first time. So behaviors are something that we learn through our experiences, and they alter, they change over time. All learned behaviors do depend in part on characteristics that have been passed on from the parents to the offspring. So the cheetahs that we see here at the bottom, they were born with the characteristics and the instincts that were necessary for hunting. They have claws that can help them catch a prey. They have the instinct to pounce on an object that attracts their attention. So when you see the little cheetahs playing at the zoo when they're small, they pounce on things, kind of like your cat does at home. But it is only through their experiences that they can learn the hunting skills that are needed to become good hunters. So they might have the characteristics and they might have the instincts that have been passed to them from their parents, but learned behaviors is what allows them to learn to become good hunters and to use those skills and those instincts. Tomorrow, in the next lesson, we are going to look at the types of learned behaviors, because there are 4 distinct categories of learned behaviors that we are going to look at in the next lesson. Those will include imprinting, conditioning, trial and error, and insight. So I'm going to pause this lesson now at this point, and we will carry on in the next lesson, pages 266 through 269 in your textbook, and we will talk more in depth about imprinting, conditioning, trial and error, and insight. I'll see you then.